This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Josh Winning. He is an author and a film writer. He's written 2 novels, The Shadow Glass and his latest book, Burn the Negative, a horror novel, I should say, set in a film environment around. Well, yeah, I don't want to spoil it because we're going to talk about it, and I think you'll get a clear idea of the atmosphere of the book and Josh's intentions. So I'm going to leave that to him to elucidate upon. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a review, spread the word. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY, small pause then, as I thought, should I call it Twitter or should I call it X? I decided to call it Twitter. I wonder when we will change our habits, or maybe never. Maybe it will collapse before we have to. Never mind. Anyway, don't worry about all of that. We'll just enjoy the conversation.
It's always a bit nerve-wracking putting a new book out there, so it's great that it kind of worked for you. That's lovely. But this idea it really came from the movies. So I'm a journalist, IRL. I'm a film journalist. I've worked for Total Film for 15 years now, I think, in a freelance capacity, doing various jobs for them. And one of the jobs that they sent me on was flying out to upstate New York to meet Lorraine Warren, who is probably a familiar name to anybody who's watched the Conjuring films, because she was the paranormal investigator, parapsychologist, perhaps they call themselves. It was her and her husband, Ed Warren, and they were very famous in the 70s for investigating so-called paranormal occurrences.
Weren't they the couple behind the Amityville house? Was that
absolutely, yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, so that was one of their big cases that they did. They also came to the UK, and she wandered around Borley Rectory one time. And a lot of the Conjuring films are based on cases that they investigated. And so I went to meet her as part of press for The Conjuring 2. I think it was around 2013. And there was just a pack of us journalists who were shipped over to America. We went to her house, which was very unusual sort of, I forget where it was. It was upstate New York. I always forget the names of these places. I want to say British Columbia. It wasn't. It was, because that's in Canada, obviously. It sounds similar to that. Maybe it was Connecticut. I think it was in Connecticut.
Right. Yeah, Connecticut sounds right, actually.
Yeah. So it was and from the street, this inconspicuous American house, but Lorraine had added to it over the years so that it actually had 13 different levels. And it's not quite the sort of hulking monstrosity you imagine. It was 13 very subtle levels, steps up and down here and there all over the place. And so we all went to her house and we got to meet her and chat to her and, find out what it's like living your life as a psychic medium. We went downstairs into the occult museum that they had built in their basement, which is this sort of treasure trove of cursed objects, such as the Annabelle doll, the original Annabelle doll that was obviously made quite a bit scarier for the Annabelle movies. And this was a place that was twice blessed by a priest once a week kind of thing to keep all the bad juju in check. So I found Lorraine Warren fascinating because she so completely believed in the paranormal, but she wasn't afraid of it. She was incredible. She died a couple of years ago, but she was so confident in her faith. She was a Christian. She believed in these awful things that happened, but she believed that she was protected by God. And I just found that really interesting. I'm an atheist myself, but I found her as a person really fascinating. And I thought one day I'd love to write a book about a psychic and kind of just dig into that a little bit. And and explore that. And so that's that was the seed of the idea for Burn the Negative. And because I think, I'm an author, you draw from your own experience. My idea became, what if I paired a psychic who was sort of a bit skeptic about the paranormal
Hmm.
with a journalist who maybe believed in it a bit or had experienced it a bit? What if I put them together and they investigated a case together? And that's where Burn the Negative was, birthed.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that about her because I think watching the Conjuring series as well, Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, they absolutely nail that quality of not in any way being sort of being serious faith people of faith, and in a way that you kind of rarely see in films that are not either sort of funded by some wacky Christian group or or it's the opposite. But yeah, they really nail that. So yeah, with Burn the Negative, you have that idea of the psychic and the journalist, but you also have this idea of the cursed film, which I found fascinating. And most people will look at this and their first thoughts will perhaps be Poltergeist.
Yeah, yeah, Poltergeist is a big one. It's obviously famous for the tragedies that befell a number of the cast members involved in the film. I've never, I didn't really set out to write a book about cursed films. I was more interested in Laura, the protagonist, who's this journalist who goes to visit the set of a horror series that is actually a remake of the cursed film that she starred in as a child. And I was just really interested in her. I think the curse, I could have slightly taken or left it, but I wanted to really get to grips with this person who had endured some weird kind of movie-based trauma in their childhood and ran full pelt in the opposite direction until she couldn't run anymore. But I do think that curse movies are interesting. Well, I say curse movies in a very like big, massive inverted commas because, I think the reason I find them interesting is because we have added this meaning to these films, and it's easy to get swept up in the ghoulishness of it and the idea of these horrific things happening to people. But then you remember these really are people, regular real life people who died in tragic circumstances. And so that's why I was quite careful with Burn the Negative to not really base the book or anything in it on anything specific to real life because I didn't want to, exploit anybody else's trauma or anything.
Hmm.
But also that wasn't what was interesting to me. I was more interested in the meaning that we apply to these films and what it is about the idea of a cursed film that is so compelling.
Yeah, it strikes me that because you put that skepticism in the book as well. There's one moment where somebody's talking about the Wizard of Oz. There's a munchkin that commits suicide on screen, according to some, internet law. And you're saying, oh, that's not. One of the characters saying, oh, that's nonsense, and it doesn't. It's just a thing. But it is kind of like that Faces of Death thing and the popularity of the idea of the snuff film in the 70s, that there's almost a magical quality to seeing death on screen, which kind of predates the internet, because once you get mobile phones and the internet, then seeing people dying on screen becomes a relatively easy thing to do. If that's what you want to go and look at, you can find those videos. But in the 70s and 80s, the idea that you could see someone actually die in front of you was like, I don't know, it just had an importance that, unfortunately, I don't think it does anymore.
Yeah, and not to be reductive, but I think there is sort of a bit of a magician's trick about it as well, where people kind of want to know, oh my God, did they actually cut that cow in half in Apocalypse Now? Did they actually, there's a snake in Friday the 13th that someone machetes in half. Did they really kill that snake? Because I think, yeah, there is that weird attraction towards the darkness of human nature. It goes all the way back to like the Colosseum. People used to pay to watch people being killed for real, of a weekend back
Mm.
then. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely bled through the ages into movies because movies do have this mystique about them where, as a film journalist, you try to explain to people that when you meet famous or when you interview famous people, it's not the same as just meeting somebody on a night out for a drink.
Mm.
It's so artificial. You've got a clock running. You go into a room, you chat to them. You've got some questions you've got written out. You chat to them for sort of 20 minutes if you're lucky. They'll probably cut it down to 10, and then you're gone and you're done and you're forgotten. And people want to know what were they like? What were they really like? And you can either say they were great or you can say they weren't great, and people can react accordingly. But you're never getting a full impression of that person. They're more of an idea, in the same way as a cursed movie is an idea.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I always find it funny if you interview someone and then for some reason you meet them afterwards, like at a social event or something. You've interviewed them, you've been part of an interview junket, and then you go for a drink at the bar and you bump into them there. And it's sort of like, oh, hi. And you just see a totally different person suddenly emerges. And I've had
Yeah.
that a couple of times happen. And it shows you the distance between who they actually are and the interviewee. Although there have been a few people who I just think, that's just absolutely who they are. Jeff
Yeah.
Goldblum would be one of those where
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I've
have
had a
you
run in with Jeff Goldblum.
there you go.
He was lovely. But I know what you mean. I kind of reference this a bit in the book as well, where when the structure of an interview is suddenly removed and you
Mm,
meet these people, it feels like this wild moment of unpredictability.
mm,
You don't have something to actually bring you together necessarily. So you're suddenly in the Wild West with them, kind of thinking, oh, do I talk to them? Do I not talk to them? What even do I talk to them about? Do I want to even talk to them anyway? Is there anything that
mm.
we should or could talk about?
No,
It's
no,
a strange
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah. Do I really want to be friends with Harrison Ford? I mean, yeah, it's obviously, but do I? You know.
Yeah. And then you start going into like the rabbit hole of like, but what do I actually want from a friend? It just starts to get a bit weird.
I mean, if I call him at 3 o'clock in the morning, is Harrison going to be there for me or not? That's the no, absolutely. I think all of that stuff that you've got Hollywood absolutely nailed down, and the junker and the idea as well. There's this kind of give and take between like they really need the interview for the publicity, so they're willing to accommodate the journalist to some degree, but also they don't want the journalist to go too far, and they want to only be seen in a certain light.
Oh yeah, like I could go on and on about the the weird power play that is going on there when you are part of, when you're a journalist and you're interviewing the talent, which is sort of like a director or an actor or whatever. You've always got the buffer of the PR between you, and it's this really bizarre power play where essentially the talent, as they call it, they need to sell the film. They need
Mm,
you to sell the film, but you as a journalist, your time is nowhere near as valuable as the time of the famous person.
mm.
And so it's a very strange dynamic. It's quite it's that thing where it's like you get passed around a little bit and sort of, your time gets cut back, or you sit waiting for hours and hours and hours.
You always get asked to be there 15 minutes before the time that's scheduled, with the
Yeah.
knowledge that it will always be 15 minutes late.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So there's always a built-in 30-minute wait if you turn up on time.
Yeah, totally. I've only ever had it once that a PR phoned me when I was on the way to an interview. I was going to Soho Hotel in London, and I was, 15 minutes early, and I got a phone call saying, "Oh, hi, Josh. I just want to check you're on your way because John Goodman, who I was interviewing, is ready for you." And I was like, "What the hell? Like, what? This has never ever happened in my life." So I like, had to run to get there, thinking I still had a good hour of sitting around. And I just
Yeah.
walked straight into the room. It was bizarre. It's never happened again.
How was he?
Oh yeah, he was lovely. It was like a career retrospective. So it
Never had
was
an Oscar nomination.
I know, and he is fantastic.
Mm,
But the thing that really strikes me is the memory of asking him about the Flintstones movie, and he just flat refused to talk about it. He said to me that he had no memory of making that film. And I mean, what can you do in that situation? And I just kind of went, "Oh, that's strange. How strange." Now to move on.
Was he hit on the head by a boulder while he was making it or something?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that is, yeah, that's not exactly a secret. That's not
yeah.
exactly.
It's like Jared Leto says that he wasn't in Urban Legend, the 1998 teen horror film. He's like, "No, I'm not in that film." Like, Jared, you clearly are. We can watch you.
Good
You're
freeze
in the
frame on
credits.
the credit. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It is, that is an odd one when you're sort of lied to your face. Because that, again, talking about the power play, that is also sort of like, I can just say this and we can both know I'm lying, but what
Yeah.
are you going to do about it? You know?
Yeah. And
Um,
also there's that I find that one particularly weird because it's sort of like denying your own career in some ways. It's like surely you just the state the place you're in now is built on the steps that were laid by your previous work, no matter what that work was. So just outright denying that he was in a film that was actually made a lot of money, it was very popular. I'm a fan of Urban Legend. To just deny that he was even in it is a really strange thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I just sometimes think there's a, I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I remember meeting Brian De Palma and asking him, saying, "Oh, you must it must be great to be here in Italy, the home of the Giallo and Dario Argento, to show this film, which obviously has these influences. I've never seen a Giallo in my life," and it was like, wait a second. Wait,
Come on.
what? Wait, what? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? Oh, my friend Martin Scorsese tells me they're good, but I've never seen one. I was like,
Wow.
it's like it's all, and he's sort of staring at me, going, go on, motherfucker,
Yeah.
go on, just tell me I'm a liar, you know?
Have a go.
It's like exactly. Come on, have a go if you think you're hard enough. Um, back to the novel, where before we stray too far into the lying celebs and the dirty lies they tell me. Um, uh, so that we've got the cursed movie, which, as you've said, you wasn't your principal thing, but I think has this fascination for people. And you've also got something which I think is probably one of the hardest things to do in horror, which is sort of to come up with a really convincing and genuinely scary villain in the Needleman. And I was thinking this is an ingenious bit of casting here.
Oh, really? Oh, tell me why, because I'm still a bit funny about the Needle Man. So you
Oh, really?
tell me your thoughts. Yeah.
Oh, okay, right. I once wrote a story called Mr. Knives. it was just it was just short story, and it was just about a guy who basically wore a coat which he could press a button and these knives would just flick up and he would just embrace people and then press a button and he'd get
Oh,
and it's just that thing that you actually say in the novel of something sharp and pointy, so claws or ice picks or a hook or and a machete, anything like that. And a guy walking around with a gun is not a horror villain.
yeah, yeah.
It has to be something bloody and visceral and sharp, a razor blade. So I just have that, and I just like the needle as a concept was, and of course it. Well, I don't want to reveal too much about the story, but it also sort of picks up on some of the metaphors that you could in terms of certain types of behavior as well.
Yeah, yeah. The Needle Man. I did an interview last week where the interviewer talked about Freddy Krueger and
Mm,
how with the Needleman I had sort of like just really gone for the Freddy Krueger um sort of reference. And I kind of answered the question a bit strangely because I was kind of thrown by that because
mm.
actually I wasn't really going for the Freddy Krueger thing. It was I think with the Needleman, and maybe this is actually a good thing. With the Needleman, I kind of wanted him to be every horror villain we've ever had in some ways. That silhouette, the black coat, the hat, the bandages, the sort of needle point fingers. And so I guess that interviewer read Freddy Krueger into it. But in my mind, I was actually weirdly thinking more about the fisherman in I Know What You Did Last Summer.
Mm,
That imposing black coat with you can't see the face, and he's got the hat tugged on top, and he's got the sharp hook in his hand. Um, and then also I was thinking about books like the point horror books that I read as a kid, like 90s American pulpy kind of horror books, where the villains kind of were quite ephemeral. They were often you weren't really sure if they were there or not. And so, there's a scene in Burn the Negative where Laura sees the needle. Well, there's a couple of scenes where Laura sees the needle man, but you don't know if he's necessarily there or not,
mm.
even when there's a body at the end of the scene, a dead body, I should say. So there were lots of different things that I was sort of like channeling, I guess. Like I didn't really think too deeply about the Needleman. I just knew that I needed to have a villain, like a named villain, who was sort of like a strong presence, like memorable enough that he, he stuck around in your memory while you were reading, but not sort of like so unique that he derailed the plot, I think is what I'm trying to
Not so the
get
whole
at.
book became about him, and you get people saying,
Yeah.
"I want another couple of novels about the Needleman."
Right, exactly. Yeah, because I was so focused on Laura with this
Mm.
book. I've not had it since, and I didn't really have it previously writing other books. But with this one, her emotional and psychological arc was set from the get-go, and the plot I built entirely around her.
Mm.
So anything that was happening sort of separate to that was just like a nice little bit of garnish, I think. It was really all about Laura.
Mm, mm. And of course, Laura has that uh, the experience of being a child actor, and that is is sort of fundamental to the character and to um, again, I don't really want to spoil too much of the story, but let's say she doesn't have, as many child actors don't. She didn't have a great parenting.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's leave it at that. And that also seems to be a really interesting. It's sort of like the return of the repressed. It's this history that you push down, and then up it pops in other formats, and in other nightmares. In this case, have you had any experience like with child actors or former child actors?
Yeah, I did. I went on a set of a horror film, one of my first ever set visits, or I should say location visits. It was a house in the English countryside. It was a
Mm.
little horror film called The Children. I've never seen it. I've got this weird streak of going on set and then never watching the film. And that's one of them. That was about very nice kids turning evil and killing people. And yeah, there was this very surreal experience of interviewing a child actor who was, I mean, she can't have been any more than 8 or 9 years old. And it was me and maybe one or two other journalists who were on location that day. And we sat and interviewed her. And I think she had sort of a minder with her. But bless her, like she didn't really have much to say because, she's just a kid doing make believe, doing what the script said, doing what the director told her to do. It was quite a weird little experience. Like she was very pleasant, but it
Yeah,
wasn't an
yeah.
interview. I couldn't really use any of the material because it was just like chatting to my nephews. They just talk nonsense all the time. Um,
I had a similar experience when Happy as Lazaro came out. And I really hate these interviews or these junkets where they say, you're going to talk to so and so, and then so and so, and then so and so. And you think, those two I don't need. Those two,
yeah,
and it's just because, but they're here and they want to do an interview. So I talked to the main actor out of Happy as Lazaro, and I think he was like 16, 17 at the time. He was just very, very young. And the director had gone to his school as part of the casting process and just picked him out of the crowd. And he was great, but he wasn't an actor. He had no real plans to be an actor. He had no real idea about the film other than, yeah, it was fun. We did this, we did that. And it was, and there was just no, it mean, it was like interviewing just a normal teenage kid, you know.
Yeah.
And he didn't. I mean, it was he didn't have any. If he had been in, he was an Italian kid, but if he'd been in Hollywood, he would have been like he'd had of his agent. He would have been trained a little bit as
Oh
well.
yeah.
None of that was there. It was just like, well, so what are you doing here?
Yeah. What cup of tea? I think the flip side of that was I interviewed Daniel Radcliffe. He was a bit older by then, but I think this was around the time of Horns, so post Harry Potter, and
Mm,
he had been trained so efficiently that every single answer he gave was solid gold. You could
mm,
use the entire interview without having any wastage whatsoever. And then I also interviewed Chloe Grace Moretz when she did the remake of Let the Right One In. And
mm,
I think she was about 13, 14, and she was sitting there with her mobile phone, and she was sort of like so seemingly grown up. She seemed so confident. She knew what she was there to do. And it was like both impressive and a little bit like you seem so grown up, but if I was your age in the industry, I would be terrified. you know?
How do you feel sort of going from your film writing into your fiction writing? I mean, obviously the two seem to be cross-fertilizing quite happily at the moment.
Yeah, I'm running out of material from journalism to turn into books. Well, the thing is, I always wanted to write books. That was always
Mm,
my dream ever since I was a kid, was I want to write stories, I want to write books. And journalism, what I grew up in the age of the internet, or the birth of the internet. So back in 97, 98, 99, I had websites and I was writing about films on different websites.
mm,
And I didn't think that what I was doing then was journalism, but it was sort of like training wheels journalism. It was getting me
right.
writing, it was getting me publishing things online. And so when I finished, I did film and communications at university, purely because I loved film and didn't know what else I was going to do with my life. Who does it? 17, 18. And so journalism I stumbled into purely because I knew that I wanted to write. I didn't know how to make a career out of that. So I went to see my lecturer at university a year after I'd graduated, and I was just aimlessly bumbling around writing stories and not really doing anything. And that's when she said to me, "Well, have you thought about journalism?" And my knee-jerk reaction was like, "Hell no," because I thought hard news, newspapers, go write for the Times, and that just really
Mm,
isn't my strength at all. But when she talked about magazines, I was like, it was like a weird moment where I was like, oh shit, yeah, like all those magazines that I love reading every single week, and people do actually write for those magazines. And even though I did actually follow, I followed the bylines through the
mm.
magazines, and I wanted to know what that person thought about this film or this TV series. But I never really thought that that's something you could actually do. It sounds so naive. So that's how I ended up getting into journalism. But I always had my eye on books, always.
Yeah, this journalism, these papers and articles, it's just specious nonsense. Just
Short form, darling.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I always have this thing of saying, I like saying at the top of the podcast, I'm a writer and film critic, and that writer goes first for a reason. You know,
Yeah. I've actually stopped saying film critic as well because I think there's so many bad connotations to the word critic now. I mean, there always have kind of been, but especially now that I'm putting my own stuff out there, I'm a bit like, no, I'm not a critic. You don't get to sharpen your knives on me just because I am a critic.
yeah, I love criticism. I'm writing less and less of it all the time. I do love it as like the discipline of it. I like the idea of trying to bring a perspective to bear on
Yeah.
very, very different things. And I like the idea of challenging myself. But just because of the types of jobs I'm getting and everything, I seem to be writing fewer and fewer reviews.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
think it's
yeah,
tough to get review work as well because
it's
it's not
disappeared.
paid very well.
It's disappearing as well. It's just
Yeah.
you know.
Absolutely, yeah. But I also do feel like there's a gap now where the words that are worth paying for. So if you're going to subscribe to a magazine or a newspaper or even websites behind a paywall, those those words are worth paying for because you're not only paying for the reviewer, you're also paying for the sub editors, the fact checkers, the editors themselves, the commissioning editors, all those people who are curating this content to ensure that it's the best content for you.
Mm.
And I think that people are less willing or less able as well. You know, we're living in tough times. People aren't able to pay for that content a lot of the time. So I think that it's tough, but people still want the quality, even if they don't want to or aren't able to pay for it. So I think we're in quite pinched, strange times when it comes to professional writing.
Do you feel that you're a horror novelist first, though? Is that where you want to go? You know, do you want to maybe leave the film world and go more into just writing pure horror?
The short answer is I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I think that everything is just so precarious that if you have a job, you should probably cling on to it with, you know, did your last breath. So I have got a part-time job, right? I work for Radio Times magazine. I'm on their film desk, so I do 3 days a week there, and that's great because that gives me time to write outside of those hours. So I'm very, and you know, I enjoy it, and I like the people I work with. So I'm loath to just throw that away to sort of like to wade too deeply into the strange, unpredictable world of books because you know you're hot shit one day and then you're dog shit the next day. It you know it can happen on in a breath. So I think like long term, I want to be able to keep writing books. I love books. I love the challenge of a book, the puzzle of a book. But it's getting harder and harder, I think, to actually get a book deal.
Mm.
So I can't really predict what's going to happen, sadly.
Mm. And for some of our listeners who are thinking Radio Times, what's that?
Oh yeah.
You're probably listening to this via wireless, so you know check yourself before you get too judgmental of
Yeah.
old-fashioned words still being used.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
It is hilarious how I can basically if I say to somebody who's over 50 that I work for the Radio Times, their face lights up.
I love
They
the
know
Radio
it, they
Times.
love
Yeah,
it, you
that's
know,
what that
it's
was our Christmas magazine
yeah,
that you'd get every Christmas.
exactly. But we're like a young magazine now, which means that we are between four our demographic between the ages of 40 and 50 is booming, which makes us young, which is
Oh wow,
nice. Yeah,
amazing!
yeah,
Good,
yeah,
good stuff. Good stuff.
yeah.
So, what are your influences as a sort of as a writer, or even you know, obviously looking at cinema because horror is something you can't doesn't stay in one lane at all. What's your sort of the genre masters that you go to and look at?
I think in terms of films, I think that Scream came along at such a like perfect moment in my teenhood.
Mm,
I saw the second one first because the video shop didn't have the first one, you know, all that kind of stuff used to happen back then. But I would have been, you know, a late teenager back then. And I think that that voice, that Kevin Williamson voice, that Wes Craven voice is just ingrained in me. And I think it was sort of like cemented by all the try-hard copycats that came after that also had that voice. Or,
mm,
you know, they just hired Kevin Williamson to write to dust up a script for them. So yeah, that kind of like postmodern, self-aware thing that is for a lot of people, I think seems affected. I think
mm,
that there's, you know, it has its detractors, absolutely. You know, people who watch Dawson's Creek and kind of go, oh, teenagers don't talk like that. Why do they talk like they're in a coffee shop in the, you know, in their 30s?
mm,
But for me, that is sort of like the voice of my generation. And so I think that Scream has tentacled its way through my writing to the point where actually I find it really difficult to write now without referencing something else.
mm, mm.
Um, and I guess it's sort of like is it called lampshading, where you reference you just call out the reference.
Oh right. Yeah, you know somebody's. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I've never heard of that, but I'm gonna pretend I did so that I can. Yeah, no.
It might be something really awful that I've completely got wrong.
it might be some weird sexual act that we're going to check at
Exactly.
Urban Dictionary. And it's like lampshading is when a partner
Yeah,
takes another consenting partner and shoves them up it. No, I really hope not.
up the lampshade.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, you do that in the book, of course. There's sort of like a moment where someone refers to the Needleman and says, "Oh, it's like Freddy Krueger, but it's not a joke." It's sort of
Yeah.
which is
Yeah, and
which is
like there's a bit where there's a discussion about Final Girls, and one of the characters is like, didn't they already make that movie? And then you get to play around with those tropes, because it's like once you've called them out, you basically have free reign to do whatever you want with them.
it's like that Tarantino thing, and I think people don't understand that Kevin Williamson for horror was kind of quite like Tarantino for crime, in that for the next 10, 15 years, you couldn't make a movie without in some, Cabin in the Woods and all those, were absolutely doing that same thing. And it was all about having people in films who had watched television, who had watched films and were
Yeah,
aware they could possibly be in a similar scenario.
yeah, definitely. I just love that like, sort of deconstruction of stories, and
Mm.
I think that's always been in my viewing, So if I look back at things that were massively influential to me, like The Never-Ending Story,
Mm.
that is a story about a story where the kid is reading a story, but he's got an avatar in the story itself. There's a whole meta conversation going on in that supposed kids film. And so I just think that is such an interesting way of telling a story. And like Wes Craven did it before Scream with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where you actually see the script writing itself as they are having a conversation in his office. And I just love that stuff. I don't know, there's just something about it that just really fascinates me.
I think New Nightmare always feels like a tryout for Scream. That it
Yeah.
sort of hasn't quite got it. It hasn't quite worked out how to do it, but you can see the road he's on.
Oh yeah. Yeah, completely. Yeah, but I love that they did that independently of each other. Wes Craven
Mm.
made Wes Craven made New Nightmare 94, and then this hotshot writer comes along with Scream. I don't know if he saw New Nightmare
Mm.
before he wrote Scream. I would be really interested to know if he had, because they're like paddling in the same bloody pool, aren't they?
No, what an image. Oh, thank you for that image. So what about horror these days? I mean, I talked to Adam Nyman, actually probably be a couple of years ago now, but he referred to this the gentrification of genre in this idea of a lot of people are making really interesting horror movies, but they're sort of gentrifying the genre as they go. I'm thinking of the so-called sort of elevated horror, a term which sends people into paroxysms, but you know exactly what film I'm talking about when I say that. So in a way, it is kind of useful. But how do you feel about that this kind of movement and or what or maybe a better way of asking the question is what of recent horror do you look at and think this is the good stuff?
It's interesting. The elevated horror thing does make people really angry, but I think a very similar thing is happening within novel fiction as well, where
Mm.
there is so-called literary horror as well. And it's a funny thing where horror's always been slightly looked down on by the mainstream. And so by coining these sort of tenuous terms, you're enabling creatives or marketing people or whatever to sort of distance themselves a little bit from the horror films that they think aren't really worthy of, critical comment or mainstream attention or whatever. So I think that it's a new form of gatekeeping or of trying to make yourself sound better than you are, that kind of thing. But I know a lot of people who love reading so-called literary horror, but they hate elevated horror films. So there's like an interesting disconnect, or there's no real parallel at all. Maybe I don't know. For me, I think I do enjoy the so-called elevated horror films. I think there's some really cool, edgy, interesting stuff being made, but they aren't my favorites. They aren't the films that I go back to for a good time. I'll watch them and I'll feel horrible the whole way through, and I feel thoroughly miserable at the end of them. Like you've looked at like a Dali painting or something, you're looking at it, you feel gross. You get the sense that you're in some way imbibing culture, but you're gonna go and eat some pizza afterwards, have like a beer or something.
That comes free with a ticket. That comes like a third off with a ticket or something. It's a
Yeah.
deal at Zeffirelli's Ambleside. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. What examples would you give me of literary horror? What are you thinking of?
Okay, well, I don't agree with anyone who says this, but
Right.
when people talk about literary horror, they are talking about the books that are published by Tor Nightfire in the US, which is this
Mm,
fantastic horror label. And it's books like Manhunt
mm,
by Gretchen Faulkner. I'm very sorry, I'm terrible at names. But Manhunt it's like a trans horror story.
right.
There is like Paul Tremblay's books are often branded
Right.
literary
Yes.
horror, even
Right.
though, I think it's just such a redundant, silly term. But it's
Mm,
it's horror that sort of has, I suppose, a kind of a social commentary to it. It's similar to elevated horrors, that
mm.
horror with more going on upstairs, that kind of thing, not just
Horror for
fun.
the thinking man, and it's cut
Absolutely.
to a guy in his sort of waistcoat and smoking a pipe in the 1950s.
Yeah. Let's talk about horror.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, I know exactly from a production point of view, I sort of see, because I go to lots of pitch meetings and things like that, and I kind of see that if you're making a low budget movie in the 1980s, 1990s, well, 1980s, the chances are you'd make this low budget movie and you talk about social realism and you talk about how you're going to go into a certain situation, you're going to film things, it's going to be handheld, it's going to be very raw, and it's going to be in the 1990s, you might do the same thing, but you might talk about how it's going to be very deep with real characters living on the edge of society. It's going to be like a crime film, but it's a
Yeah.
crime film that people don't usually do because it's not going to be generically crime, but it's going to be. And then nowadays, I feel that a lot of people making art house movies, especially with a sort of Lynchian feel to it, will introduce like it's really about poverty in Brazil, but they're werewolves,
Yeah.
or it's really about a black experience of living in New York, but he's a vampire. And
Yeah.
and it's sort of like, yeah, but it doesn't have anything, it could really easily not be a vampire and you could just, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? It doesn't really, you're not bringing much more to the table, except you're sort of like jazzing it up a bit, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that jazzing it up a bit can sometimes fall a bit flat. I think you can, if you're not being really honest to your story, do you really want to tell a story about a vampire who's a 14-year-old boy? I'm sorry, I'm using that example. That's actually not a bad film. It's a film called Transfusion. But
Yeah.
that is a real example of they obviously have that money and they're sort of and that budget, and that's what they're going to do.
I don't know. I think that it's getting harder to sell. It's getting harder to make films, maybe. I mean, it's always been hard, but I think it's
Mm,
especially now. And I think that it really does have to have that killer hook. It's got to be a high concept
mm,
nowadays. And I think that 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 that's the reason for the escalating. But it's about that kind of stuff is the attempt to like hook somebody's attention if they're scrolling through Instagram or
mm.
just happen to catch a bus stop or whatever. Um, so yeah, like I'm racking my brains trying to think which horror films from the last 10 years have become all-time favorites that I'll go back to over and over again. And I can't really think of many. Like there have been some great horror films. I
Mm.
think that female directors have really been doing amazing stuff like Raw. I loved Raw.
Mm.
The
Titane,
Babadook was fantastic.
brilliant. Yeah.
There is some great stuff, but again, they're not really ones that I'm in a real rush to go back to.
I mean, I like Brandon Cronenberg. I like
Oh yeah.
Infinity Pool and Possessor. I think were two of the best. And I love David Cronenberg for the good old days, but I think the student has now become the master when it comes to those films. I think he's really genuinely tapping into something. I can't wait to see his next film, which is a J.G. Ballard Supercat,
Ooh.
which is almost too on the nose. It's a little bit like when
Yeah.
David Cronenberg did Naked Lunch. It was like, it's almost, and of course, again, it's, David Cronenberg did Crash.
Yeah.
It's almost too good a match. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's interesting. It's a really interesting to see where horror is going from the point of view. I'd never thought of Paul Tremblay, but of course that's absolutely right. And I have noticed, you'll read a book of literary fiction and it will have like a high concept hook. But I think this problem of how we pitch and sell movies shapes the kind of stories we tell in a way which has unwanted consequences. And by unwanted consequences, I mean the Meg and Cocaine Bear.
Right.
You can tell where Cocaine Bear is it's about a bear that eats a lot of cocaine, and everyone goes, I want to give, they do the Futurama meme of, take my money. But hang on a minute, what's the story?
Yeah.
You
What's the bear's journey?
well, but even that, I mean, those pitch sessions where someone sits down and says, well, it's all about friendship, really, or something like that. You just want,
Yeah.
there's a bit of me that just goes, yeah, you're filling empty boxes that you have to fill because it's on the form. But is it about friendship? I mean, like,
Yeah.
Jaws kind of does have this male camaraderie to it, as well as being about a big shark. But Roller Coaster is just about roller coaster.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm not. I don't know. Maybe it's just all the hoops you have to jump through, and that's it. And shut up, John. It's just
No, I
do.
totally agree. No, I do think that, as my dad says, you've got to care about the characters.
Mm,
You're watching, because, like, on a deep level, you want to figure out your shit, and stories help you do that.
mm,
And maybe going to watch, a very high concept but brainless film helps you do that by providing an escape in some way or other. But I do kind of agree that you go to the movies to sort of see yourself reflected, and see, those characters become your avatar essentially. And you're watching them act things out, and you might disagree and say, oh, I would never have done that, how stupid. But you're engaging with what they're doing. And I
mm.
do think that the art of the character arc is is something that maybe gets a bit lost sometimes. Not that I'm speaking from any place of authority, or, my book's great, whatever. But I
No,
do think that you want that emotional arc. It's why the Star Wars, just to make a really easy, take an easy blow, the Star Wars prequels for me didn't work because the emotional arc is just, what is it? It's not even there. It doesn't really exist in any way that isn't superficial.
Yeah, and there's only so much you can do about how this guy turns into a villain in a movie which is essentially for children. It's
Yeah,
just like, and I mean, to give it his fair due, he does sort of go and kill the younglings.
yeah,
So it does go to some dark places, but I don't know. I mean, I want to rewatch the prequels again because I'd met a person recently who swore to me that they were the best of the Star Wars series, and I was like, whenever I meet someone like that, I think you're crazy, but I kind of want to see. I want to sit in your head and watch the films to get
oh
what you're
god,
getting
yeah,
out of them. Um,
absolutely. I love it. I love it when people love things,
mm.
and you want to be able to love it in the same way. But we're all different. We don't all see the same things.
That's my experience of going to festivals. Everyone who's at that festival is incredibly knowledgeable about film. Nobody goes to a festival not knowing anything about films. And
Yeah,
you will meet people who the very worst film is their favorite film, and people who the very best film is their least favorite film. And all everything, and they will all be able to argue it articulately. And it's just like, wow. In other words,
yeah,
it's kind of the opposite of Twitter.
yeah, yeah.
Listen,
Look,
Josh,
it's an actual conversation.
yes, exactly. And you can drink stuff and you can have
Yeah, that
sandwiches,
helps.
and it's amazing.
Yeah.
Listen, Josh, before I let you go, I have to ask you for a recommended film book. By the
Okay.
way, I think you're the first novelist we've had on. No, no, you're not. You're the second because we had Alan Dean Foster uh,
Uh,
talking about novelizations. So, but
oh,
then he
cool.
does have his whole. He was a novelist beforehand and all the way through and after as well. So,
Yeah. I would love to get in on that novelization gig because that sounds like so much like fun, but also quite easy, hopefully. I don't
yeah,
know.
well, he was actually very, very honest about it. I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
what do you do? How do you get into them?" And he was just like, "Oh, like I got a music stand on my desk, and I put the script there, and I put it on page one, and I start typing in the dialogue and sort of filling in he said, she said, and I was like,
Wow.
it's not that." I
Yeah.
describe some of it because you can't see it. It's like
Yeah.
really, it's really that easy. But he was very
I want that job.
well, unfortunately, he's kind of not got that much of it anymore because DVDs
Uh,
came in and everyone, yeah, I mean, novelizations were our DVDs, they were our,
yeah.
and there were a whole series. I get very obsessed with these. There was a whole series of Dirty Harry books.
Wow.
It's just like
Like not novelizations, but actually continued adventures.
continued adventures of Dirty Harry. Yeah. And then you've
Wow.
got a series like Die Hard, which I think is like three different novels from three different authors. And, Die Hard 2 is a novel from a different series. And Die Hard
Yikes.
1, I think Die Hard 1 is a novel by a guy who wrote a novel, and the character was Frank Sinatra in The Detective.
Yeah.
And so when Die Hard came along, he had first refusal because it was part of his contract. If we ever make a
Yeah.
sequel, you have to offer it to Frank Sinatra. So Frank Sinatra was offered Die Hard,
Yeah.
which
I love.
which would have been amazing. It wouldn't have
Can you
been
imagine?
yippee yay motherfucker. It would have been doobie doobie doo doo.
Just like
Sorry.
dancing down the elevator shaft.
Absolutely. Champagne. Oh, no. That was a little bit more Pavarotti than Sinatra. So, Josh, the question was recommended film book.
So mine is The Book of Horror by Matt Glasby, who I think maybe you've had on the podcast previously.
Yes, yes, he's been on the
Yeah,
podcast. Yes.
it's a beautiful, beautiful horror book. It's basically looking into the scariest films ever made. And I think it starts with Psycho and it comes all the way up to present day of whenever it was published, sort of 2 or 3 years ago. It's got
Mm.
beautiful art in it, and it very cleverly rates each film in terms of like what it is about them that is scary. So there's I'm trying to remember what the definitions are. I can't remember, but it's a really cool horror book. I really recommend it.
Yeah, it's sort of like gory or jump scares or sort
Yeah.
of sense of doom.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. Yeah.
What's the thing that in a horror movie scares you the most? What's the thing that
Somebody coming into your house at night when you're
mm,
asleep, that to me is
mm,
terrifying. I find it really interesting how there seems to be like a real split in terms of some people are terrified by ghosts, some people are terrified by humans. So I've got a friend who is obsessed with true crime. She will devour true crime like nothing else. But if you start talking about a ghost story, she is out of there. But I am the complete opposite. If talk about ghosts, that's fine. They don't exist. But an actual human being coming into your house and whatever happens from there on, that is absolutely the worst thing that could happen, I think.
yeah, The Strangers or something like
Yeah.
along those along on
Well,
the
the Fall, the TV series The Fall,
yes, yeah,
that gave me
yeah,
nightmares.
right,
Worst
right.
nightmare. What about you?
Um, well, actually, William Freaking died this week, and I find The Exorcist very scary, but not for the reasons that are usually, the. It's because it posits a universe in which the Catholic Church are right. And I find
Oh
that,
God,
you know
yeah.
what I mean? I find that
Yeah.
idea that this is the way the universe is organized is the most terrifying thing. I mean, it's like Angel Heart creeps me out. So that sort of that thing of like a universal
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like Lovecraft for that because it's about how indifferent the universe is to you, and
Yeah.
so Lucio Fulci's The Beyond has a sort of
Yeah.
ending which is incredibly. So that sort of metaphysical horror is very. But if I had to
Mm.
say something sort of local, like a local scare, yes, somebody being in the house, it would definitely, definitely somebody appearing at the back screen of the.
Yeah.
And I'm a sucker for jump scares. I fly in the air when. Recently, we watched recently, whenever it came out, we watched The Quiet Place, and we do this thing of having popcorn and putting M&Ms in the popcorn. It's a recipe that I've made myself, and so we had that and The Quiet Place 2. We're at the cinema, and The Quiet Place 2 is on, and the first jump scare happens, and of course, I just jump, and the freaking M&Ms hadn't sunk far enough, and they went all over the place and rolled to the front of the cinema because the rake of the cinema is a very
Yeah.
shallow one, so you just hear them rolling slowly to the. Oh, leave them. But
Maybe
that was,
this could be a sequel to the Book of Horror. It could be the popcorn test,
yeah,
which is you
exactly.
get sent to horror films, and if you send popcorn and M&Ms flying everywhere, it
There
gets a
you
10 out of 10.
Absolutely, but the M&M test will be the Bechdel test for horror films. Well, listen, Josh, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. It was wonderful reading your book. I love that kind of horror. I know it's a real cliche, that page turner stuff. And I loved. Oh, that was something extra I wanted to add. Is the sort of, you have sort of in between the chapters, you have those pages of the screenplay and pages of a review and an interview and stuff, and that takes me all the way back to Dracula and the excerpts from a newspaper. That stuff is the literary version of found footage.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I kind of when they first when my editor first started talking about how they were going to design the book, he said, "Oh, I'm not really sure if we need to design the interstitials, the found documents." And I kind of said, "Well, I feel like if we're going to do them, we should kind of do them."
Yeah.
Thinking that they would put together something quite basic. And then the book designer went absolutely beyond my expectations, around the world and back again. I think she did the design for Grady Hendrix's The Final Girl Support Group
Right.
book as well. And so she found like bespoke bits of paper that she could put the script on. She hand wrote diary entries. She doodled Care Bears and creepy ghost faces and numbers all over. And she kind of basically turned this sort of like campy horror book into frankly, a bit of a work of art. Like I take
Mm.
no credit for that whatsoever. I say it with no ego. It was entirely her, and she has made this book beyond anything it would have been if, it was just down to me, basically.
What was her name again?
So she's called Laura Corliss. And
Excellent. So,
I've got a feeling she's an in-house designer for Penguin Random House.
wow.
She's fantastic. She's done
Yeah.
such an amazing job on it. Yeah, just amazing.
Shout out to her then for that. And I look, my favorite was the back of the VHS cover.
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought
yeah.
that
I couldn't
was.
believe. I just thought she did such a great job.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, thanks so much for talking to me, Josh. Take care.
Thank you. No, it's been brilliant. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did. You can get Josh's novel from all good bookshops, as they say, and from all internet sites. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can just tap on that in order to secure your own copy, as I'm sure you're doing right as I'm speaking. Next week, we've got a very special guest, Janine Basinger, who is one of the prime film historians, beloved of anybody who's interested in film. She's a fantastic woman with over 15 books to her name, and she really goes back to the very beginnings of books on film, I tell you the truth. And so it's a complete honor to have the opportunity to speak to her, and I hope you will all come back to listen to that conversation. I promise you will not be disappointed. Until then, take care.